One way to do it is to take the free will defense, which is to argue that God's primary aim was to grant us free will. And in fact, it would be contradictory for God to then intervene, even to prevent evil. This is, I think, the most common response, right? That yes, God did grant us free will, and yes, there's a lot of evil, but God can't interfere even to prevent evil because that goes against God's primary mission with his creation, right? And then you would fill in those details depending on your religious persuasion. So that's one way, what we would call the free will defense. Another common rejoinder is, or theodicy, is what's called the soul-making defense. And this is quite common. You hear a lot of people say this, that in order to be good, we need so much evil, right? In order to value things like love and friendship and charity and things like that, there has to be bad things that happen, or else we wouldn't appreciate the good things, right? In a simplified version. So in other words, this is the argument that says in order for our souls to be worthy of eternal paradise rather than damnation, they need to overcome evil, and or good cannot exist without evil. That's a very common theodicy. Another way to argue for, or another way to give a theodicy in this sense, is to give the best of all possible worlds case. And this is essentially to argue that in the end, all evils are actually just leading to some greater good, and or that this is the best of all possible worlds God could have created. So we might complain about the world that we inhabit, but this is the best possible world we could have hoped for that God created, right? So notice that there's a similar strand, a familiar strand going through all three of these defenses, but they're all types of, but distinct theodicies that try to reconcile the amount of evil with standard notions of God's attributes. Okay. Obviously, the strength of each theodicy or defense will depend on its ability to account for why a God that is omnipotent, omniscient, and omnibenevolent would allow both moral evil and natural evil, right? That's something that the theist is going to have to account for. Because, right, now, interestingly, I should point out here, a lot of people are going to say that natural disasters are now no longer a natural evil, but a moral evil, especially since climate change, humans have accelerated, right? The probabilities of big storms and the increased global temperatures, right? That it's really humans. But obviously, there are things like volcanoes that really aren't dependent at all on climate change, at least as far as I know, that would still occur even with or without humans, right? But there is an interesting case to be made that climate change is a moral evil, right? If you're framing it in terms of the theist versus atheist framing.